An education system should be willing to change for the advancement of society. Recently, the U.S. public school system has been faced with the task of ensuring society advances or remains stagnant. The task is deciding if LGBT plus education should be added to the curriculums of America's public schools. Queer education, anti-racism, and a retelling of U.S. history has been rebranded as a new form of woke politics and are under heavy scrutiny by the far right. The fight for equality of all sexual orientations and gender identities encompasses many issues. The most pressing is adding LGBT plus center classes into our schools. With robust, thought-provoking school systems across our nation, we can inform people about factually proven information instead of half-truths. When an education system isn't preparing students for a broad spectrum of topics, it purposely misinforms the students. This lack of knowledge that a student may never gain could result in unchallenged prejudice about another group. Unchallenged biases can turn into blatant bigotry, like homophobia, which is defined as the anxiety, aversion, and discomfort that some individuals experience in response to being around or thinking about LGBT people or behavior. Homophobia, along with discrimination, is a unique stressor experienced by LGBT plus people. For LGBT plus students, it can result in internalized homophobia. This is a mental condition that can affect the quality of life of an LGBT plus person. The official medical definition of internalized homophobia is when a person consciously or unconsciously accepts homophobic biases and applies these biases to themselves. It disrupts social relations between members of the LGBT plus community, and it is also linked to unhealthy habits such as risky sex behaviors. The condition can place many mental burdens on an individual and can become a condition that appears early as childhood. One way internalized homophobia affects queer people is how it impacts relationship dynamics. According to a journal on counseling psychology, internalized homophobia is associated with more significant relationship problems, even among couples. Community connectedness, outness, and depression are also all factors, but these are factors independent of internalized homophobia. This source proves that internalized homophobia can be a risk factor for many adverse outcomes for a queer individual. One of the most damaging outcomes of internalized homophobia is the abuse that queer people inflict upon each other because of having this condition. A study examining the relationship between internalized homophobia and same-sex domestic violence has conducted positive and significant associations between internalized homophobia and same-sex partner violence. This outward pressure that queer people face from society turns inward towards those who understand their struggle the most. Another study about same-sex partner violence among queer men in the UK also has alarming results. In a year-long trial study of 444 queer men, 44% of men reported being victims of intimate partner violence, while 19% admitted to being perpetrators of violence. An additional study done with queer men in China also has similar results. Out of 610 participants, nearly 30% of men admitted to experiencing intimate partner violence. These studies indicate a deeper societal issue that LGBT communities worldwide have to deal with. These studies suggest that internalized homophobia is not only a personal issue, but is a side effect from living in an anti-queer, patriarchal, post-colonial society. Along with relationship issues, internalized homophobia can be linked to negative behavior, such as risky sexual behavior. For example, there was a study done from 2010 to 2011 examining sexual behavior in gay black men in New York City. Some of the factors found links between internalized homophobia and condomless sex. Gay black men, who account for 1% of the United States population, also account for around 25% of new HIV infections yearly. Additionally, the CDC reports that along with racism and stigma, homophobia significantly affects Black American gay men. Dealing with constant societal pressure can make a member of a marginalized group internalize hurtful tropes about their group, which can turn into self-hatred. Internalized oppression appears in people who are a part of a socially stigmatized group. Much discourse surrounding queer education has much to do with the education of American youth. The leading conservative argument regarding the validity of LGBT plus education is that parents should have a say in what's taught. In bills like HB 1557, also known as the Don't Say Gay bill, promote a age-appropriate curriculum, quote unquote. However, most conservatives do not consider what harm is being caused by a lack of an inclusive curriculum. A case study of gay male youth indicated a high amount of harassment and violence that young queer people face in school. In the study, 80% of teenagers and young adults ages 15 to 21 reported experiencing verbal attacks, and 17% reported that they were physically assaulted. The same study also indicated heightened suicide attempt rate among young queer youth and an increased high school dropout rate. While straight youth experience their childhood with typical pressures and experience that most children and teenagers face, queer youth have the same experiences while navigating through a society that does not create space for them and is not even sympathetic to their unique needs. The pressure queer youth face in the United States is immeasurable, and the conditions are worse when analyzing LGBT plus oppression from an intersectional perspective. This pressure turns into internalized oppression as they face backlash from family, peers, and coworkers. Whether it is clear discrimination, threats of violence, alienation, or stereotyping, these factors make young queer people feel horrible about their identity and the community that they are a part of. This could alienate a young person from even accepting their identity and could result in a young person participating in upholding the same oppression that they experience. The personal issues that LGBT plus youth face are political, and society must adapt to change so all youth in the United States can grow up with a positive sense of self. Recently, LGBT plus education has become a mainstream hot-button issue for those who do not believe it should be taught in schools. Much of the backlash is due to a lack of understanding in myths like the gay agenda. However, mainstream discourse leaves out precisely what LGBT plus education is and why it is important to be taught to all students, not even just LGBT plus students. Without being fully educated, persistent discrimination against LGBT people will appear in the most unfavorable locations, including the workplace. Much of the mystique or misunderstanding of queer people stems from a lack of education. If a person is accurately taught queer education, they would learn about queer history, gender roles, and an inclusive sex education. Having an inclusive education system will invalidate bigoted narratives, and the internalized feelings of worthlessness among members of the queer community will cease. There have been many arguments regarding whether queer education should be even taught in schools due to fears that queer education could, quote-unquote, turn someone gay. A counter-argument from the American far right is that children's brains are not developed enough for gender-affirming medication and, quote-unquote, parents' rights must be protected. They believe that placing LGBT plus education in schools will result in children being quote-unquote over-sexualized or quote-unquote forcing a sexual orientation on the youth. However, the United States public education system has always had a sexual education program since 1912. Despite a vague approach, the program evolved into a class that teaches students about the importance of safe sex, STIs, birth control, and overall sexual wellness. Since its start, the program has always talked overtly about sexual topics, and there hasn't been much controversy about the program as there has been in recent times. When queer education comes into question, it then becomes too much or a part of an evil agenda. If conservatives want a program that doesn't want to be focused on sexual issues, they would then try to end all sex ed programs instead of removing LGBT topics from the program. Inclusive education is proven to be helpful for all students. For example, results from a study done in 1984 have shown that math scores for students with and without disabilities have improved almost a grade level after participating in an inclusive learning program. An additional study from 2000 revealed that children with disabilities that are educated in a typical classroom environment are more likely to score higher than their peers in a segregated environment. These studies show that all students benefit from working together in class, regardless of their identity. If classrooms could reflect the true diversity of our society, that would be a true step towards progress. While having an inclusive education will accurately reflect our society, having an inclusive curriculum will reflect all of our life experiences. The most important benefit of having an inclusive curriculum is developing an understanding of other groups that are not their own. Educating about different identities, especially those at a young age, can be an effective way to challenge prejudice. Suppose a child can grow up and view a member of an out-group as simply another member of society and not a deviant, destructive member. In that case, negative feelings and fear that become homophobia could cease to exist. A comprehensive education system will benefit all students and will make our society a better place for all people. If an inclusive education system is not achieved, prejudice will remain unchallenged, and conditions like internalized homophobia will appear, and those humanity is being threatened by far-right politicians.